So Kant begins the first chapter of the groundwork by telling us that his goal in the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals is to establish the supreme principle of morality. And he tells us that that task is sort of self-contained, that he doesn't need to call upon the information or methodologies of any other intellectual pursuit. And in fact, he explicitly says that this task should be kept separate from every other kind of moral inquiry. And he mentions, for instance, moral anthropology, so the study of what people perceive to be right or wrong, their practices, things like that. That needs to be kept separate from this self-contained task of establishing the supreme principle of morality. So, how does he think he's going to do that? Well, in pursuing this goal, he's going to start off here in this first chapter through a method of analysis. He's going to look at common moral knowledge and analyze what it is that unifies this common moral knowledge to distill the underlying principle that unifies that knowledge, the supreme moral principle. And that'll be what he does in chapter 1. Now, in chapter 2, he's going to help us to understand why this principle is possible, how it works to determine action and the ethical status of actions by moving synthetically from the principle to synthesize how our common moral knowledge, our familiar facts, follows from the supreme moral principle that he discovered in the first chapter. And we'll focus on this project of analysis in chapter 1 in this lecture, and then in the next lecture we'll turn to that synthetic project in chapter 2. So Kant then begins his inquiry, and the first thing that he thinks about is, well, what is good? What can be said to be good without qualification? What is the object of morality? And he says nothing in the world or out of it can possibly be conceived that could be called good without any qualification, relativization, or exception, except a good will. And so a good will is a will that is good without qualification, without relativization, and without exception. It's the one thing that can be said to be good. But what makes a will good? And he considers and rejects 3 answers. Qualities of mind, intelligence, compassion, dispositions, courage, fortune, accidents of birth, and rejects all of them as possibilities. So he says no qualities of mind, dispositions, or fortunes are immune from misuse or bad outcome. So he says the intelligent person can be evil. The courageous person can be a fool. So qualities of mind can fail to be good. Dispositions can fail to be good. And the rich person can be dissolute. Fortunes, accidents of birth can result in bad wills also. And so it's not those features that make a will good. Just like no object in his mind is intrinsically good or bad. So a bit of gold might be thought of as good if we're going to sell it for money to buy food and clothing and so on. But it could be considered to be bad if someone uses it to bash our skull in. So the objects aren't intrinsically good or bad. They're not good without qualification, without exception. Goals aren't good without qualification or exception either. And so it's got to be the will. What about the will makes it good? Well, it's not qualities of mind, it's not dispositions, and it's not fortune. Since it's not the qualities of mind, the dispositions, of the fortunes that are going to make our wills good, Kant supposes the goodness of the will has to come from the will's being perfectly adapted to its purpose. And so here he draws from the teleology that emerges in biology. The idea is that the purpose of the eyes, the end to which they're adapted, their goal is to facilitate vision. The purpose of the heart, the end to which it's been evolved, is the pumping and circulation of blood. So by purpose, Kant means the structure and function of the will, what it's supposed to do, the reason why it's there. Just like the reason why the heart is there is to pump blood. Its function is circulation. So if the goodness of the will comes from its being perfectly adapted to its purpose, it's fulfilling its function, what are the candidates that we might have for the function of the will? And he considers two kinds. The first kind here are conditional purposes. So the will may serve some conditional purpose, some goal that is a means to an end. So it might facilitate survival or thriving or happiness. So he talks about kind of conditional purposes that have been identified as potential functions of our will. Now he says, look, the rational will, the will of rational creatures, is poorly suited to these kind of conditional purposes. It's not a very good means to accomplishing these ends. And he gives us two reasons to suppose that's true. The first reason is he thinks that instinct better suits the attainment of survival, thriving, and even happiness. And so he would point to how facile animals are at surviving and thriving and how they can be contented. And they do all that without, in his mind, any rational willing. And so he says the rational will, rumination and guiding action through willing the results of that rumination, that's just a bad means to accomplishing these goals. And he gives us a second reason, which that the rational will actually might interfere with the accomplishment of these goals. And he focuses specifically on happiness. And he tells us that understanding, that is, rational reflection, often undermines happiness and creates more needs. So rational reflection about the mortal nature of our existence, can undermine our happiness by making us aware of the inevitability of our own demise. A rational appreciation of the relative circumstances of our lives. We have more money than these people, but less money than these. We live in this terrible place. We live in this wonderful place. The recognition of our lot in life relative to other people can create a sense of inadequacy, of further need, and so on. And hence, understanding, he thinks, actually undermines or thwarts the accomplishment, at least in this particular conditional purpose, of achieving happiness. So conditional purposes are right out. What's the alternative? Well, he says, look, if the rational will isn't suited to conditional purposes, such as attaining happiness, then its purpose has to be an unconditional purpose. And there's really only one purpose he can think of that is an unconditional purpose that's a candidate for the will, producing a good will. And so he says a good will is good, not because of what it accomplishes, not because of its conditional purposes, but because of its intent, because of its production of goodness in its intent. And so this will be how Kant thinks about goodness of the will in terms of intent, in terms of motivations for action and not what you accomplish by those actions. And this is very much within that deontological framework and very much in contrast to that consequentialist framework for thinking about goodness in the ethical sphere. So it seems then that rational will is acting in accordance with its purpose. And he specifies that more specifically, focusing in on what is it about intent that makes the will good. And he says, intent makes the will good when it leads the will to act from duty. Thus, a good will is a will that acts from duty. So we'll want to understand what that phrase means, what duty means, what it means to act from duty. And there's a contrasting notion, acting in accordance with duty that Kant will reject. And we'll do that in the next segment.